What is up, YouTube? All right, so today I want to talk about a subject that's been on my mind for quite some time, but I hadn't really found the time or the reason to talk about this subject. But thanks to some recent bans on Twitter, I think there's really no better time to talk about this. And this is related to Learn to Code. Now, obviously on Twitter, there's a bunch of people being banned for this because they're tweeting at journalists who have recently been laid off from like BuzzFeed and Vice and telling them to hashtag Learn to Code. And surprisingly, Twitter finds this to be harassment, so they're actually willing and have banned people for tweeting at journalists who've recently been laid off telling them to learn to code. Now, what I want to talk about is a kind of side topic related to this, and it's, can anybody learn to code? There's this big debate going on right now about, whether or not programming and coding is a realistic job prospect for a lot of people. And you kind of have two camps. There's like some people that think that pretty much anybody can code, and then there's another camp that tends to think that this is a very, high level of intelligence field where you need a certain IQ, and if you don't have that certain level of IQ, or if you just don't have like the genetic propensity for it, that you're not going to be able to learn how to code. So that's what I want to talk about today and give my thoughts on how realistic I think it is for the average person to get into software engineering. Now, the first thing I want to talk about, one of the first things I think you should consider here is just how flexible the human brain can be sometimes. I mean, for a minute, just like wipe your brain of all history knowledge that you have from school and imagine trying to tell somebody that there's a girl who is blind and deaf and that someone out there is set on teaching that person how to communicate, that they're going to teach them the alphabet, they're going to teach them how to read lips and actually understand what people are saying and actually be able to communicate despite being born blind and deaf. Like, you can't see and you can't hear, but somehow that person's like, no, I'm going to teach this person how to communicate. I think most people would say that's just a hopeless goal. Like, come on. There's just no chance there. I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but that's just not realistic. But as we know, if you've read anything about Helen Keller growing up, that actually happened. And it's one of the more amazing things as far as education is concerned. Now, another thing to consider is how rigid our thinking can be at a certain point in time. We today tend to communicate with keyboards. I can't really remember the last time I hand wrote a note to somebody. Now, if you already know how to type, you kind of have to distance yourself from that skill set a little bit. But imagine, creating a keyboard, however many years ago, and telling people who are writing, hey, I want you to stop what you're doing with that pen and paper or that pencil and paper, and instead use this thing that we're calling a keyboard. There's one key for each letter in the alphabet. There's a couple keys for some other symbols. And rather than writing with a pen, you can instead use your fingers to write with this keyboard, and it'll actually be faster. I don't think it would be that crazy to anticipate a certain level of skepticism. To them, it would look like learning the piano, but instead of pressing a couple of notes to create music, you're instead pressing characters in the alphabet to create written word or a book or whatever it is that you're writing. To them, it would seem crazy. If anything, texting would seem like it would be faster. It's like, well, I could just use 2 thumbs, 10 fingers. That's too much dexterity. It feels like why don't I just learn the piano instead? They would think that texting with 2 thumbs would be easier. A smaller keyboard, I can see all the keys. I could just do that instead. But as anybody today knows, typing on a keyboard is much faster than texting or writing with a pen and paper. Now, the final thing I think is worth considering on this topic is how new programming is in general. This is something that is in the span of human history. It's like the blink of an eye, but it hasn't been around that long. This isn't something like science, whatever field of science it is. This isn't something like mathematics. This is something that's relatively new. So the amount of time that it's been around isn't that long, which on top of that means that the amount of time we've had to teach this skill and learn how to innovate and teach the skill in different ways, basically to improve our ways of teaching, just isn't that big. So that's something to consider here, that just because to date we haven't been able to teach certain people how to program doesn't mean we'll never be able to. It just might mean that we're not good enough at teaching the skill set yet. Now, one thing on this topic that I think a lot of people just skip over is a lot of the nuance, like a lot of the finer details that I think if you were to consider these finer details would drastically influence your opinion on this subject. For instance, what's the environment of teaching somebody to code? Specifically, if you're on the side of thinking that, oh, you need an IQ of a certain level or higher to be able to learn how to program, what is the environment that this person is learning how to program in? Is it a college with a large class where there's 200-300 kids in the class? Is it one-on-one time with the professor? You know, you just happen to fall into some sort of mentorship or some sort of apprenticeship with somebody who already knows how to program and you're just constantly working one-on-one? Is it a coding boot camp? You know, there are so many different ways that you could approach learning how to program, and the criticism against this idea that anybody can learn how to code is just too generalized. So the point being, you know, there's a lot of different environments in which you can teach somebody a new skill, and I feel like a lot of these different environments are just kind of glossed over. When people say, oh, not everybody can learn how to code, it's only a certain number of smart people that can learn how to code, I don't think they're factoring in the environment. Like, do you mean in a college setting? Do you mean in a coding boot camp? Do you mean in an apprenticeship? You know, what context are you talking about here? Because if the context switches entirely to public education, sure, I might actually agree with you and say, yeah, I don't think everybody can learn how to code, because I don't think that is the most suitable environment for learning how to code, and public education in general just sucks. So the environment is one thing that I think a lot of people really need to consider. Another thing would be the level of proficiency. Like, what level of proficiency are we talking about here? What does learning how to code even mean? And I rarely see this addressed. For example, for some of you who might already know how to program a little bit, are we talking about writing your own sorting algorithm from scratch, as you typically have to do at some point in a computer science course? Is that what you mean by learning how to code? Or is it the ability to call .sort in JavaScript or Ruby? Like, you can sort a list of items using .sort. To me, that's real programming. But some people might say, oh no, if you can't write a sorting algorithm yourself, that's not real programming. So we also have to distinguish here as to what real programming means, or what learning how to code means. There's also the issue of like code cleanliness. You know, there's how abstracted your code might be. If somebody can write a piece of code to parse through a CSV file and spit out figures for some business, but their code is 500 lines long, as long as it works and it does what the client wants it to do, I don't really care. But there's going to be somebody else that says, wait, that could be 10 lines of code. This person doesn't know how to program. They might not know how to program as well as you. They might not know how to abstract and refactor their codes into smaller functions. They might have, you know, very like linear programming, but that doesn't mean they're not a programmer. They might not be the best, but it doesn't mean they're not a programmer. To give you an analogy with this, imagine somebody like Scott Adams. He's created probably one of the most successful, well-known comics of all time, Dilbert. Compare him to somebody like Leonardo da Vinci, there's a pretty big gap in artistic skills there. And Scott Adams himself would tell you this. But just because there's a gap in skill set there, and just because they have very different approaches to art, does that mean that Scott Adams isn't a real artist? To me, my answer would be he's an artist. He's created a comic, he's a writer, he publishes this comic, people read it, they buy his books, they enjoy it. He's an artist. He's not Da Vinci, but he's still an artist. All right, so now that I've gone over some of the other factors I think you need to consider before coming to a conclusion on this subject matter, it's time for me to give my opinion. Do I think anybody can learn to code? And obviously, there are always going to be exceptions to a question like this. But my answer would be that assuming a person doesn't have some severe mental disabilities, some severe learning disabilities, I think basically anyone can learn how to code. They might not be world class, they might not make the major breakthroughs in CS. They might not be the person who makes some sort of mesh network, internet network. They're not going to necessarily make huge breakthroughs. I'll give you the IQ argument there, that you're going to need a certain level of IQ to make the breakthroughs in computer science. But when we're talking about your day-to-day coding at your typical business, I honestly think just about anybody can learn how to code. Now, are they going to stick with it long enough to become a coder? That's a completely separate issue. But if their life depended on it and they needed to get to a point to where they could write some basic programs, I think anybody can learn to code. Now, to give you some examples of, why I think anybody can learn to code, again, going back to the whole Scott Adams versus Da Vinci thing, there's a lot of businesses out there, small to medium-sized businesses, that probably use Excel sheets all the time. They use Excel sheets to keep track of their sales, their numbers, their leads, all this stuff. And with just a little bit of programming knowledge, you could write some Visual Basic in the back end of Excel to create reports for you. You could write some fancy macros. There are a number of things that you could do in Excel. And to me, that's real programming. Now, some snobby dickhead programmers out there are probably like, that's not real programming. I don't care. You have your elitist idea of what programming is. If you're not doing some embedded hardware C++ bullshit, then it's not programming. But as far as I'm concerned, if you're writing code, even if it's Visual Basic in Excel, and you're able to provide value to a business or to a client, you're a programmer. That's all I care about. Not to mention that most of the businesses I've worked at, most of the companies I've worked at, we're not doing mind-blowing stuff with programming. We're building CRUD apps. A person fills out a form, they submit it, you store it to a database, you pull that stuff, display it to them, they might be able to edit it. This isn't crazy shit. We're not building Twitch from scratch. We're not building video streaming from scratch. All of these other services have been built, and you're just plugging and playing. This stuff isn't as complicated as a lot of people want to make it out to be. And that's one of the most frustrating things to me about this whole issue, is that most of the people I see online talking about this are people who don't even program. They're not even actual software engineers. They're just some people who have a strong opinion about this for whatever reason. And these people are more often than not the people who are so focused on the IQ part of this debate. They're like, oh, if your IQ is below 120, you're fucked. You could never be a programmer. When this type of argument is coming from somebody who doesn't even code, I can only give that opinion so much weight. To me, it's no different than somebody who's never actually tried being an artist, who's never tried painting or drawing, saying, oh no, there's a certain gene that you need to learn how to draw, to learn how to paint. It's well, you've never even tried. So how much does your opinion really matter here? Whereas if you talk to any professional artist, they'll tell you anybody can learn how to draw, anybody can learn how to paint. It's just a fucking bitch to learn. It's going to take a lot of time. You're going to have a lot of patience, a lot of discipline. But if you stick with it long enough, anybody can learn how to do it. And just like a lot of professional artists will say anybody can learn how to draw, anybody can learn how to paint, I think the exact same thing about programming. I think as long as you stick with it, you can eventually learn to code. So now you know my thoughts on this issue and what I think about the ability for the average person to learn how to code. And this also applies to the journalists. I'm not going to say it on Twitter because I don't want to get suspended, but yes, even the journalists can learn how to code if they're willing to stick with it long enough. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love to hear your comments below. Do you think I'm crazy on this subject? Do you think I nailed it? Do you think anybody can learn how to code if they're willing to stick with it long enough? And then also, if you are serious about learning how to code and you want to learn how to code from somebody who's in the industry, I do have a book. It's called The Angular Tutorial. It is the highest rated book on Angular and automated testing on Amazon. I have gotten nothing but 5-star reviews on Amazon, even privately email sent to me. I've gotten nothing but positive feedback. So if you want to learn how to program, if you want to check out that book, you can check it out at theangulartutorial.org. I got a link in the description below. And if you like this video, please leave a like below. Really helps me out. And also subscribe to the channel if you want to stay up to date on my latest videos. Thanks for watching.